questions that relate to a particular type, or if you want me to clarify something on a slide, please feel free to send that question in, or make a note in the chat box, and I'll try to cover those as I go through. And Sarah, feel free to jump in to let me know if something particularly relevant comes up. So with the tornado, this is the person that is being kind of overbearing, either in meetings or one-on-one conversations. Maybe you're noticing that because of their overbearing personality, other people are not speaking up. You're not really getting the feedback that you need. That can be a really tricky situation. This is one that always comes up when I'm teaching facilitation skills and running effective meetings. They always say, well, my boss being in the meeting just changes the entire dynamic. I mean, people clam up, they won't say anything. So what are some tips I can use? So here are some specific techniques. First of all, think about meeting with them separately to try to engage them and try to ask for their support before the meeting. Typically, if you've got the tornado in your organization or you're working for the tornado, it's not a surprise. They don't just show up at your meeting and act completely different. If they're like this, you've probably seen some of these more aggressive elements of their personality show themselves in other situations. So don't wait until you get to the meeting. You want to meet with them a week or so prior. And when you do, you might have a conversation with them that sounds something like this. Phil, thank you so much for making time to meet with me. I know how packed your calendar is. I really, really appreciate it. I also really wanted to thank you for carving out some time to come to the team meeting on Friday. I really think it's important that you're there. I think that I can talk about how important the project is and how important the team is, and I can say it a million times, but it doesn't mean nearly as much as you actually being there. When people see you there, they know it's important. And so I really, really want to thank you for that. I did want to try to talk to you, though, before the meeting to try to get a little bit of advice, because one concern I do have is the positive side of having hierarchy in the room is it elevates the visibility of the project. People show up on time, yada, yada. You know how that goes. But then the negative side, the other side of that coin is, you know how it is. People sometimes clam up. Oh, the boss is in the room. Oh, the VP's here. They clam up. Maybe they won't be as honest or as candid. A lot of times people just respect you so much that they just glom onto whatever you say. So instead of coming up with their own ideas, they just want to sign off on the last thing that you said. And I know how important it is to you and to me that we really put the ball in their court and we really hear from them. I really want to put the onus on them. So that's the only thing that I'm struggling with. And I was just wondering if you could think of maybe something we could do to help ensure that we really, really do engage them. We get a lot of candid feedback from them. What are your thoughts? So with that, what I've done is I haven't gone up to them and said, hey, Phil, you're a tornado man, you're a bull in the china shop. I need you to bring it down a notch, or I don't want you there. I haven't said that. But what I have done is I've tried to obviously be very complimentary, but also be very honest about the fact that hierarchy in the room does change the dynamic. I'm not going to get into their specific personality, obviously, but the reality is hierarchy can change the dynamic, and I want their support. More importantly, I want their advice. So notice that that's what I've done. I haven't come in telling them what to do, because I promise you, most bosses don't like to be told what to do. But what they do like is they like it when you seek out their advice. They like being the all-knowing, omniscient, omnipotent one. So you coming there seeking their advice, that is a recipe for success. And then you just go with what they come up with. 90% of the time, they will come up with something that's reasonable. They might say, well, gosh, now that you mentioned it, I hadn't really thought about that, but, why don't I just pop in for the first 15 minutes and then just kind of let you take it from there? How about if I do that? Oh, I hadn't thought about that, Phil, but that does make a lot of sense. Maybe we could do that. Or they might say, well, you know what? I'm going to intentionally kind of hold back. And then I might say, well, you know what? I'll kind of hold back too. So you and I will hold back. We'll really kind of throw it to them, and then we'll consciously try to only chime in once they've really had their say. I think that's a good plan. So it's about letting it be their idea and then you sign off on their recommendation, as opposed to you being in the very awkward position of trying to tell your boss what you want them to do, which I promise you generally does not work well. So that's a wonderful, wonderful technique. Let's say you've missed the boat, you didn't have the pre-meeting, you're in the session, your boss is sitting to your immediate left and they're just talking way too much. You really want to hear from other people. Round robin is a great technique. I use this all the time. You can also use it in conference call situations. If you're face to face and if my dominant person is on my immediate left, what I'll do is I'll chime in and I'll probably validate their last point. I'll say, Phil, that was a really, really great point about the vendor options. I do think we maybe need to expand our vendor options, because I'm looking at my watch, because we've only got about 15 more minutes. And I know that we had agreed to get a variety of different ideas. I want to do just a quick round robin. Can I take 5 minutes? And I just want to start over here. And you're going to start to your immediate right, the exact opposite of where the boss is sitting, and just go around the table, get one comment from each person, but you're going in a row, person by person by person by person. So now you've instituted a process, so they no longer can dominate the discussion or the conversation, because they're going to have to wait their turn until you get all the way around to them. Again, if you're in a virtual situation, you can do it as well. You can say, hey, we've heard a lot from the East Coast. I want to go around real quick, do a lightning round and hear from every region, and then just go one by one by one by one. Another one that I like to call complement, document, and pivot. A lot of times when we've got a boss who's dominating, it's very intimidating, and we have a tendency to kind of shrink and just let them have the spotlight, and that can be very dangerous. A nice tactful way to regain that control is what I call complement, document, and pivot, and that's the next two bullets here. It sounds something like this. You might say, Phil, gosh, those vendor options, I hadn't really thought about expanding to additional vendors, but I can see your point there. It's such a good point. I want to be sure we don't lose it. So let me jot this down on the flip chart. So you literally write down their point on the flip chart, then you check back in with them. So I've written here, expand vendor options to include X, Y, and Z. Jim, is that pretty much or Phil, is that pretty much your point? And they say, yeah, Dana, you've got it. Oh, okay, great. That's great point. Honestly, I hadn't really thought about that. I just want to see if I can pull in a few other people. And now what you'll do is you'll pivot either to a different person or a different topic. And you'll say, Mary, Luke, I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts about the vendor option idea? And then do you have any other thoughts on this? Or you might say, this is one idea, and then you might write 5 blank tick marks on the flip chart and say, before we leave, I'd like to get 5 other ideas. What do other people think? And so now you're pivoting. Writing it down is key, because you want that person to feel heard. You want to ensure that they know that we got their point, so they don't have to keep going on and on like a broken record. And then finally, if you feel like they're kind of sucking up all the oxygen in the room, stand up. As soon as you stand up, you kind of reassert your control in that situation, and then you use one of these techniques that I've talked about. So standing up can be really, really helpful. So let's go to our next poll, which is, how often do you encounter a boss who is unclear on what they want? Would you say that's rarely, sometimes, often, or almost always? So I want to get a sense of, how prevalent would you feel this is for the different bosses that you've had throughout your career? Rarely, sometimes, often, or almost always? I'm going to hope there's not a lot of almost always out there.
Well, we will see. Okay. All right. You all voted quickly this time. Thank you. Okay. So 13% said rarely. Most people, 50% said sometimes.
Okay.
25% said often. And 13% said almost always.
Wow. So if you add the 25 and the 13, what is that, 38%? I mean, that's almost a third of you. Think about that. That's over, I'm sorry, not almost, over a third of you are saying that this is behavior you're encountering often or almost always. So that's just additional validation. It's not just me. Thank you for that. That unfortunately, the clueless chameleon is out there. They really, really are out there. And unfortunately, it can be so detrimental to our ourselves, our teams, and our projects. So let's take a look at some specific techniques that you can use to manage the clueless chameleon. First one is what I say, I call them the clarify and prioritize the triple constraints early and often. Now, triple constraint, you may not be as familiar with that phrase, but this comes out of project management terminology. We like to call the triple constraint, sometimes people refer to them as good, fast, and cheap, but technically it's a triangle. And on each end of the triangle, you see one of these constraints, either scope, time, or cost. And in the center is quality because they all impact quality. And it's so important from a project management perspective that you ensure that your boss, your client, your sponsor, whoever's the executive who's over this project provides clarity in terms of what are the priorities for those triple constraints. Because every task or effort that you're working on, there is some sort of prioritization. Maybe the number one element is cost. So they might say, when you try to clarify this with them, this is their opportunity to clarify, say, hey, you know what? Even if you turn it in a few days late, I could deal with that. Or let's say the rollout happens not the 1st of September, but the end of September, we could deal with that. But our budget is absolutely constrained. We cannot spend more than $100,000. Or maybe the number one constraint is time. Maybe they say, well, you know what? I know we've got a list of 100 requirements. I promise you, we could live with it, even if you don't deliver on every single bell and whistle, even if we had to shrink the list from 100 requirements to 80 requirements. And even maybe if we had to spend a little bit more money, we probably could do that. But we absolutely have to go live December 31st. That date cannot move. That is constraint number one. So what you want to do with the clueless chameleon, because they will have a tendency to be very fuzzy on the constraints, you really want to pin them down and say, hey, let's take a look at cost, time, and scope, and say, if you had to pick one, which is the one that is absolutely number one, cannot move. And then for you as an individual contributor or as a project manager or a team lead, that's really, really valuable feedback for you to know going forward. And it's also important that the two of you confirm that, get on the same page, you get it in writing so that they don't come back a month later and try to switch things up on you. So another one is identify and document in scope and out of scope elements for the task or the project or the team. And notice here that what I'm saying with many of these is about document. With the clueless chameleon, you have to document because you know the saying goes, if it's not written down, it wasn't said. And the clueless chameleon is one that they can have a very sporadic memory. They can be very selective about what they remember. And sometimes that's completely unintentional. I mean, honestly, if you ask me what I had for lunch 3 days ago, I probably can't remember either. So you really want to avoid that drama and ensure that you document all of these critical elements about the project, the task, the team, so that if they do have a foggy memory or if they are trying to move the goalpost on you, it's much easier for you to provide clarity and focus to say, no, 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 this is what we talked about, in January. And it's not to say that things can't change, but you don't want to feel, sometimes when I have the clueless chameleon, I say I feel like it's playing a game of perpetual scavenger hunt. It's like emotional or intellectual scavenger hunt, and you don't want to feel like you're constantly doing that. So you want to clarify with them, hey, this is my list of what's in scope, and then this is also my list of what's out of scope. Sometimes people will talk about what's in scope, but they won't explicitly list what's out of scope. And I would submit to you that that out of scope list is really almost more important than the in scope list, because some of those in scope items can still be a little bit vague. I remember when we had a client one time and we were doing vendor analysis with them, but we also had an out of scope item slide. And in our out of scope item, at our list of out of scope items, we had listed RFP development, meaning we were not taking responsibility for documenting their RFP, and which was probably going to be hundreds of pages long and take a ton of time and work, and sending it out to the vendors. And thank God for us that we did that, because when we had that kickoff meeting with the client, they pushed back and they said, oh, well, since we had talked about vendor analysis in the contract, we just assumed that that also included the RFP document. So it was healthy for us to have that conversation, have that meeting of the minds with them at the beginning, at the outset, so that we were in a position to make changes if we needed to. And with the Clueless Chameleon, this is what you have to do. I mean, this is something that's so critical. If they're going to be kind of all over the place, you want as much as you can to try to pin them down so that if they do make a change, it's acknowledged as a change, as opposed to them just giving you different direction all the time and you kind of running around like a chicken with your head cut off. So the next one is develop a mock-up for key deliverables. This is another area where you definitely can get burnt by the Clueless Chameleon, because what will happen is sometimes they'll assign you something or they'll pontificate about something and get you started on a task that they haven't clearly thought through. And then when you come back 2 weeks later, oh, I never said that, or what's that? That's not what I meant. I wanted an Excel document. What this is just a, this isn't what I meant by business plan, but they never clarified what they meant by a business plan. So what we're going to ask, what I coach people to do is, if they're being vague, I want you to get real specific and hand them something, because let's be honest, sometimes they don't know what they want. They might say a business plan and they don't know exactly what it is, but you develop a mock-up, put it in front of them, and then that helps give both of you clarity. That gives you a starting point so that maybe they can say, well, you know what, this is kind of, this would be great, but could we do this and then also add a timetable with it? Or also add a roles and responsibility document. I think if we had those three elements, and that would be what we would need. Or sometimes you can give it to them and let's be honest, sometimes they'll say, I'm not exactly sure what I want, but I know it's not that. But that's still good information and good data. So sometimes, unfortunately, with the Clueless Chameleon, it's a bit of an iterative process of pulling out of them what they actually want. But believe it or not, that's better than you're showing up on D-Day only to find out that they've now moved the goalposts someplace completely different, or what you've worked on is completely not what they wanted. The next one is identify their soapbox issue early, and stress, WIIFT, is what's in it for them. So again, if they're kind of moving all over the place and you can see that that's having a detrimental effect on you, your effectiveness, the task, the project, the team, one way to message that to them is in language that is meaningful to them. So what does that mean? We all have something that we really care about, okay? Something that's near and dear to our heart. So you know your boss. Are they focused on getting promoted? Are they focused on pleasing the external client? Are they focused on customer satisfaction, reducing cycle times, increasing quality? Whatever it is, you want to develop language around that soapbox issue. So for example, let's say that you're really making a request to them for additional resources, or the last thing they told you is they're going to yank somebody off the team, and you know that that's going to have a really negative impact. And you know their soapbox issue is looking good to this particular client. This is the biggest client of their career. They have to look good to that client. You might say something like this: Linda, gosh, I know that you sent that email out about the fact that Jake is going to need to get pulled off the team. I hadn't been aware of that previously, so thank you for that update. I did, though, just want to alert you of something, because I want to be sure you always have the best information. Jake has become an invaluable resource to that client, the Hightower client. They absolutely love him. Literally, the VP there emailed me a couple weeks ago saying they don't know how they survived without Jake as a part of their extended team. So if he is pulled from the project, I just wanted you to have a heads up that you probably might need to brace for some really negative blowback from the client. And I know that it's so important for us to, do everything we can to satisfy, this is a critical client, to satisfy them. So I really, really just wanted to share that with you in advance. So again, what we're doing is we're creating messaging around their soapbox issue so that we can, hopefully try to prevent disaster. Next one, obtain signatures on the project charter. Hopefully that's not completely foreign language to you. I mentioned the triple constraints earlier, but I want to show you these project charter elements. For me, this is absolutely, I teach lots and lots of training classes. If I had to pick maybe 3 gold nuggets from most of the classes that I teach, this is definitely one of them. If you're not developing project charters for your important projects. And when I say project, it does not have to be some 50 million three-year project. I mean, it could be a 3-week project, but just something that's important, something, PMI defines a project by, hey, does it have a beginning and an end? And is it providing a unique product or service? So anything that would halfway meet that project definition, think about not just talking about some of these items, but actually documenting some of this. This becomes even more important when you have the clueless chameleon on your team, or when you have the clueless chameleon as a boss or as an executive that is providing support for the project. Because when you don't document these items, the clueless chameleon will go all over the place and they will just keep that project spinning, and you just won't be as successful because you're just not getting the clarity and the support that you need. So it's really important that you have these things documented. So in a way, you're kind of pinning them down and you're getting clarity. Now, if they want to come in and change something, we're not trying to present a facade saying they can never change anything, but we want to acknowledge it as a change. We don't want to have a situation where we've identified 5 key deliverables and then a week later they've got a list of 10 deliverables and we're all standing there looking at each other. So these are some of the elements that you might include in the project charter. And what's so important is the signatures. Signatures, signatures, signatures. Signatures equal accountability, or I should say signatures encourage accountability. It's one thing for us to be in the meeting and, half the people are paying attention, the other half are playing Candy Crush and thinking about which route they're going to take on the way home to beat traffic. That's just reality. But when people know, hey, we're going to have this conversation, but then we're going to pass this document around and everyone's going to sign it, I promise you that meeting takes on a different tone. People have a different level of skin in the game. People have a different level of accountability throughout the life cycle of that project. So to the extent that you can, these are some of the critical elements you want to talk through, and then you want to get the signatures, and one of those signatures is from your boss, your project sponsor, your project executive, whomever that person might be. That is a little bit of CYA and protection for you, so that let's say 2 months in, they do throw a whole bunch of requirements in that weren't initially required, or the scope becomes fuzzy because now they're talking about including some things that you thought were out of scope previously, or they want to pull resources from the team and you had previously agreed to having certain resources for a certain amount of time. Having that all documented and having those signatures is so helpful. The next one, explicitly ask how they will define success for the project. Again, the clueless chameleon is the one that, you might have thought the project was great, and then you come to find out end of the year, oh, they didn't think it was so great, or they had a completely different metric that they never quite bothered to tell you about. When I was a strategy consultant for years, there was a big project that we worked on for a year and a half. It came in on time, on budget. By all accounts, it was a tremendous success. The client loved us. Then about a year after the project, we found out that that project internally had been deemed a failure. And my director really hit the roof. And so he called up the client and he was like, "Well, wait a minute. We came in on time on budget. What are you talking about? How? I heard that that project was deemed a failure." And she said, "Oh, yeah. Well, I know. We loved it. You guys did a great job. But actually, we didn't get our capital investment. We didn't recoup our capital investment within 18 months. And that's our own internal metric in terms of how we define whether a project is a success or failure." And then he was like, "Well, but wait a minute. We were there a year and a half. Nobody ever mentioned to us that you have to get a payback within 18 months." And she looked at him and said, "Well, I mean, you guys never asked." So that was a really, really difficult learning point for us, that you've really got to pull this information out of people. You can't just assume that because you deliver it and it's on time, on budget, that it was successful. Ask them how they will define success. This is something that I actively do, even with some of this more touchy-feely sorts of things that I get involved with. So even when I'm going out to facilitate a team retreat and I'm talking to a client about their goals for the retreat, etc., the logistics, I try to always ask them, "Please finish this sentence for me. I will consider this project a, or I'm sorry, I will consider this retreat a success if." And I'm so interested to hear what they have to say. And guess what? Most people can't tell me right away because most people aren't that laser focused or haven't thought through it to that level of detail. Like, what is my number one goal in terms of success? What will success look like when we walk out of that room? What will have had to have happened for me to think, "Oh, yes, that was a huge success"? And I've had clients tell me, "Oh, if people are talking about what they learned 3 months later." I'm doing a session actually tomorrow, and this particular client said, "I really think it's a success if everybody walks out feeling like they bonded with two additional people that they hadn't quite bonded with before." And that is critical for me in terms of, as a facilitator, knowing how to funnel my energy and knowing how to design the event. So you specifically want to ask the Clueless Chameleon how they're going to define success. And then the last one: define critical success factors and ask for what you need early. We've all been in situations where the task failed or the project failed because the boss wasn't around, the boss didn't do what they needed to do, didn't provide resources, etc., etc. So this is a best practice that we developed over a decade ago, having been burned because of some weak sponsors, to be quite honest, on some projects. So what we just started doing was, after the project, we would do a debrief session in terms of what worked and what didn't work, what contributed to maybe some negative outcomes for the project. And we found that a lot of times not having the appropriate senior leadership support in some specific areas was really, really key. And so we started defining these as critical success factors. And so we would then sit down with that senior executive and go through, say, "Hey, in order to be successful on this next project, this is what we need from you." So it's, instead of us just begging and asking for something, we're saying, "Hey, these are critical factors that contribute to the success of the project." And you can get very specific. We would list very specific things. We would say, "Hey, we need your commitment to participate in the first 15 minutes of this meeting, and this meeting. We need access to your calendar," or "We need to ensure there are going to be several critical emails that need to go out to staff. We'll type them, we'll do all the work, but we need an agreement from you that you will send out this email, and this email. Maybe we need a firm commitment that a certain key resource will not get pulled through the life cycle of the project, or maybe we're asking for a backup resource in case that resource gets pulled." So what we're saying here is, don't wait until you're starting to have problems as a result of the Clueless Chameleon. These are things that you can do proactively to try to ensure that you are successful in spite of having the Clueless Chameleon. So with that, let's move on to our next poll, which is, are your boss's expectations typically realistic? So we've got three options here. Not even close, they're usually dreaming. 2, expectations are usually a stretch but fairly realistic. Or 3, they're typically very realistic and reasonable. So, what would you say if you had to characterize your boss's typical expectations?
All right. Very excited to see this one. Okay. Thank you all for voting. So 53% say expectations are usually a stretch but fairly realistic. So we have
Okay.
a fair crowd here. 27% say that they're usually dreaming. So it's
Oh,
still
wow.
a third. 20% say they're very realistic and reasonable.
Okay. So a little bit, yeah, all over the board, but it is interesting that over a quarter, over 25% of you said not even close, they're usually dreaming. And then if we add the first two together, that's an overwhelming percentage, say either not even close or they're usually a stretch. So let's take a look at some specific techniques that you can use if you find yourself with the wishful thinker type boss or project sponsor. So, first one is you need to be proactive with them. I mean, they might ask for the moon, okay, ask for you to do absolutely everything and anything and everything, but you might need to kind of come back to them to ask them to separate the wants from the needs. That's a really important process to help them provide a little bit more clarity in terms of prioritization. Because if you've got the wishful thinker, they might ask for a Lamborghini when a skateboard will do. Sometimes you need to ask them why they're asking for what they're asking for. They may be asking for a Lamborghini because they think they need one, but you have additional intelligence and knowledge. Say, hey, there's a skateboard over here that'll do it just as well for faster and cheaper. So you really want to have that conversation with them around, okay, if I had to, here are the 6 requirements. Which of these would you say are absolute wants, have to happen? I'm sorry, our needs absolutely have to happen. And then which ones would you say are the wants? So again, it always goes back to that prioritization. Next one, let's say they really are pushing you into some territory that your gut is telling you is just not realistic. This dog won't hunt. This is not going to happen. This is a Titanic. I see it coming. We've all been in that situation where you feel like you've been given the dog project or the dog task, but you don't want to tell them they've got an ugly baby, or you don't want to tell them, you don't want to just refuse to do it. A wonderful way to approach that is to do some risk analysis. There are lots of different ways you can conduct risk analysis. So without getting off into a whole nother webinar, let me just talk through a really simple example. And what's more important is the concept, not the actual methodology or tool that you use, but just the concept. Take some time, get the right people in the room, and really try to brainstorm and think through what could possibly go wrong. What's the probability of that happening? And then what's the overall impact if it does happen? So here's an example. You might have a table that looks like this. If you're planning a wedding, what are things that can go wrong? So you might say, hey, it may rain on my wedding day. I'm getting married outside, or I could have a band that doesn't show up at the reception. So you want to come up with a long list. Maybe there are 10 or 15 potential risk events. Then the next question you ask, for each risk event, what's the probability? You can either use a percentage or you could just say high, medium, low if you feel like a percentage is too difficult for you to get. So here I've got 50% probability of it raining on my wedding day. Next question, what is the financial impact to the organization or to the project if that happens? Well, we're going to have to immediately get an indoor option, and so pay expedited costs or pay additional costs for the expedited option. So that'll cost us about $5,000. So here it's 5,000. If you're doing high, medium, low, you might just say, hey, is the impact high, medium, or low? Then for severity, the severity column, you just multiply the impact by the probability. So here, 50% times $5,000 is $2,500 in severity. Or if you use low, medium, high, you've got a low probability, high impact, so that's moderate severity. So once you've done that, for every potential risk event, now you've got a number or a low, medium, high for each cell in the severity column. That enables you to prioritize your risk events by severity. So now I can look at, okay, this is the number one Most severe potential risk event, it's costing us anticipated $10,000, all the way down to the least costly. One of the reasons why you want to do that is maybe you've got 50 different risk events. You can't plan for everything. You want to prioritize, and then for your highest severity events, try to come up with some mitigation strategies. These are things that we're going to do proactively to try to prevent that risk event from occurring. And also, backup plan. What if I can't prevent it? If it does happen, what's my backup plan going to be? So, for example, if my band doesn't show at the reception, my mitigation strategies might include, hey, I'll put some penalty clauses in the contract that really kind of motivate them to be there and be there on time. I'll also confirm with them 1 week and 1 day prior. So a little bit of, nagging in there. Nagging works to try to ensure that they're there. And then conversely, the backup plan, I can make an iPod playlist just as a backup in case all else fails, or I could have a backup band on standby. So this is a way for you to actually document some level of analysis so you don't feel like you're walking into the wishful thinker type boss with wringing your hands, just kind of whining and complaining about you can't do it, or you think it's going to be too much, or you don't think you can be successful. So it really allows you to speak from a position of strength. And also, it's managing up. It's you're alerting them to these potential risks. Say, hey, Jack, I'm all over this project. I'm here to execute. I see where you're going with this. But in all honesty, I feel like I'm doing you a disservice if I see some potential major barriers or some potential major pitfalls and I don't alert you to those as soon as possible. I know if I were sitting in your seat, that's exactly what I would want. So that's why I took some time with the team. We conducted some risk analysis, and these are some concern areas, and I just wanted to talk some of these through with you. Now, your goal with this might be to have them rethink the project. I mean, maybe it doesn't make sense, or maybe the timing is off. So you can talk them through that. But you see how you're bringing the data to them, you're describing what could potentially go wrong, but they still ultimately have that decision. Even if they don't necessarily decide in your favor, or even if they don't provide you the support, for example, for the mitigation strategies, for example, you've still covered yourself to a degree. You've still documented it, you've still made the request. So if and when the worst happens, there still is that paper trail of your doing what you should have done in terms of trying to position the project for success. The next one, provide choices between the triple constraint trade-off. So it goes back to the triple constraints that we talked about before. I just want to go back to that slide. Bigger, cheaper, faster. So again, the wishful thinker, they might want it all. They don't want to spend any money. They want it done immediately, but they want to include 1,000 requirements, in the system. And that just doesn't quite work. So the triple constraint is a wonderful tool that you can use to kind of push back on them to create a more realistic situation and say, Jim, I hear what you're saying about the 1,000 requirements, but just looking at past projects, that's something that generally would take more than a year and cost more than $1 million. I mean, I'm happy certainly to do the absolute best that we can with the resources that we have. I'm just wondering which of these could we be a little bit more flexible with? If we had to either decrease the scope, increase the cycle time, or increase the cost, which one of those do you think we could make a change in? So you really kind of want to guide them through that discussion. And sometimes they don't understand the implications of what they're asking for. And I know we've all been in that situation. I certainly can recall being in that situation as a consultant working for an IT company where I'm sitting in the meeting and then the client asks, oh, could we also get a new org redesign as part of this, larger IT project? And I unfortunately was like the one person on the team who had done some training classes in e-business governance. E-business and e-commerce was new at the time, and this was like I think the late, yeah, right around Y2K. And so the director just out of nowhere was like, oh yeah, Dana's our e-business org change expert, our e-business governance expert. Yeah, we could just throw that in. That'll be just another 2 weeks of work. And I'm like, about to cry. I'm like, oh my God, there's no way. I mean, this is at least 2 months worth of work. But they're so far removed from the work, they don't know that they're asking me to boil the ocean. So some of it also is talking them through the triple constraints, but also helping them understand the implications of what they're asking for. And part of that can be part of that pushing back if expectations are realistic. And so when I had that conversation with the director, I also had to remind him of some other things that I had on my plate and say, hey, if I drop everything and if I get a team of 10 people, then maybe we, could do that in 2 weeks. But I was also putting a lot of attention on this project and this project. Is it okay if I move away from those projects and just focus exclusively on that? And then of course he's like, oh, no, 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 those projects are important. Those projects are important. I just had no idea that it would take that much time. Let me rethink this, or let me negotiate some additional time with the client. So that education process becomes really important. So I know we were running a little short on time, so I want to quickly get to this. Actually, let's if you don't mind, let's skip this last poll because I know we're running short on time. I want to answer a couple questions if I can. So this is about the egomaniac boss. So let's talk through some tips with them. This is the boss that they think they're wonderful, they're perfect, they've got the best ideas, etc. One that has worked for me well, and I will say out of the four, this one might be the most difficult. Ask for permission to be honest early on. What I tend to find is if you wait until a difficult position presents itself, it becomes 10 times harder to have a very candid, frank conversation with a boss about a problem area. So don't wait until there's a problem to either start building a relationship. And as part of that, ask for permission to be honest. And that might sound like this. You might say, hey, Jim, I know that part of what you're looking for from me is you want me to be the one who's, I'm assuming you want me to be the one who's just going to be really frank, honest, upfront. I'll be completely honest with you. You're my boss. It's hard for me to maybe push back to a boss sometimes. So just tell me, if you just want me to execute, I'm fine. I'm happy just executing. But if you also are looking for me to maybe let you know if I think I might have a different idea or if I have a concern about something that you've proposed, I'm happy to do that as well. So just let me know kind of which is better for you. And I promise you 99% of the time they will say, "Oh, no, 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 I want you to be honest. If you see me going over a cliff, I want you to grab the wheel. I want you to say something." So what I find is when you do that, then 3 months later, when you do need to step in and say something, it becomes so much easier to do that. And you can even reference the conversation you had 3 months earlier. You can say, hey, Jim, I'm not sure if I should say anything or not, but I know we had that conversation back in September about you want me to be brutally honest. So if you don't mind, can I get 5 minutes of brutal honesty time here with you? And for me, that's worked really well. Another one is pose concerns as questions. As I mentioned earlier, most people do not like being told what to do. And I promise you, your boss does not like being told what to do. They do, however, appreciate it when you alert them to something or you ask a question that might alert them to something. So instead of saying, hey, I think that's a crazy idea, morale is going to tank if you try to get rid of telecommuting, you might instead turn it into a question. Say, gosh, yeah, I can see where you're going. I do think if we had more FaceTime with each other, that would really help productivity. I could see those situations. The only concern I have, Jim, it is a great idea. The only concern is I know that a lot of the people have come from environments where they've telecommuted 1 or 2 days a week. I know that a lot of them have rearranged some of their other commitments around that. And I'm just wondering if we think that might have a really negative morale impact in the short term. That's the only concern. I'm just wondering if we might want to think through that a little bit more so. So again, you're posing it as a question and then letting them, ultimately they can do what they want. So it's a way for you to provide the feedback in a more nuanced, less confrontational way. Review the project charter with them to reinforce agreed upon priorities. Again, solicit signatures. So this is one that I put in there because some of the egomaniac bosses that I've come up with, they love chasing the new shiny object. Like they go to a conference, they come back and they've got another idea. They always have these great ideas. And their random great ideas take people off track. And so the project charter can be another tool to help bring them back on track, remind them of what we've agreed to, remind them of what's on everyone's plate, and remind them of the previously stated priorities. For new ideas, complement but ask questions about areas of concern, conduct risk analysis if needed. I've mentioned that before. Point out the triple constraint trade-offs. If they propose something that's completely unrealistic, propose a clearly defined change management process to objectively vet proposed changes and new ideas. So again, if they're chasing the new shiny object, we're not saying we can't change gears. We're not saying we can't add that into the portfolio. But maybe what we should do is have some sort of defined change management process so that when these changes are proposed, we can look at them within the context of the impact of the change on staff, on resources, on other elements of the project, cost, time, quality, scope, etc. And I've had, in project management world, we literally have like a change management form. I mean, you might not want to get that formal, but some sort of process so that we feel good about the changes that we're making. We're not making random decisions in a vacuum, but having that form enables us to give them specific feedback so that they understand the implications of the change. They understand the consequences that come with the change, and so that we can all make much more informed decisions. So with that, I want to thank you guys so much for having me. This is one of my favorite topics. Please, if you're looking for more information, feel free to link in with me or join my newsletter, reach out to me. I do have the book coming out first quarter 2019, so you can probably get more information there through LinkedIn as I post it. Also on my website, I have tons of free videos, free white papers, so feel free to download those as well. So Sarah, I'll turn it back over to you.
Great, Dana. Thank you so much. These are just such important issues for us to all conquer so that we can be more productive in the workplace. So I really appreciate your expertise today. And we'll just ask you a couple questions before we lose you. First one, how do you manage with a boss who is not present but expects progress on tasks, especially if you are in a consulting or freelancing role? But this can also just come up with so many more telework situations these days.
Yes, actually, it's so interesting you bring that up. That's another one of the personality types that we're going to talk about in the book, and I've written about, and that's the missing in action boss. I call them the MIA boss. And the good news is a lot of these techniques can be helpful for them as well. I'll just throw out a couple. I will mention I've written an article that I think is on quartz.com on this topic. If you can't find it, email me and I'm happy to send it to you. And I specifically detail techniques for dealing with the missing in action boss. One, get to know their admin or their assistant and leverage their access if possible. If they have an admin or assistant, they're struggling with this as well. They might be able to give you tips for, hey, best time to catch him is early in the morning or late in the evening. You can also leverage their access. So even if that person is traveling, they'll usually check in with their admin several times a day. And so if you might be able to put a question or an issue front of mind for you to ask the admin to ask that MIA boss. And so you might be able to leverage their access that way. You also might inquire about the possibility of using a group calendar for scheduling purposes. With the MIA boss, that boss is in and out so much, if you can at least have access to that person's calendar so you can see when they're going to be gone for a week at a time, or you can see when they are going to be in the office to best utilize that time, that could be helpful as well. And then the last really quick thing I'll add, because I know we're running out of time, is a little bit of complimenting, just reminding them how critical their input is. Sometimes they feel like they can just leave and the project's on autopilot. Remind them of the danger when we don't have your feedback, your input, your support, and just help get their advice about how to help them still support the project, even though you understand that they have to be gone a lot. So I know we're at 3 o'clock, so I really want to thank you guys, and I really appreciate your time.
Okay, thank you so much, Dana. And again, you can follow up with Dana on the links that she's provided, and I will send a follow up email with this information, the presentation deck, and the link to the Emory webinar archive. So, everyone, stay tuned. We have another webinar coming up at the end of the month. If you are considering changing careers, we're going to talk about creating a career one sheet. So, if you're wondering what that is, join us on March 31st. We also have many events happening during the month of March and April, networking events in our major alumni cities around the US and a couple here in Atlanta. So I will send you information about that as well, but know that you can join us in person if you want to expand your network. But have a great rest of the day. And Dana, thank you again for your time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.